The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was the most impressive building in the known universe. Its walls were made of living crystal that changed color with the mood of the room. Its ceiling showed the real-time positions of every star in the galaxy. 12 different species had built it together over 300 years, and it stood as a symbol of cooperation and peace. Today, Ambassador Kira Vance thought it looked like a circus tent full of cowards. She stood at the speaking platform, a small human woman surrounded by aliens of every shape and size. The Velith delegates towered above her, their blue skin and forearms making them look like angry statues. The Torvashi floated in their water tanks, their tentacles waving nervously. The crystalline High Arbiter Xyloth sat on his throne of light, looking down at her like she was an insect asking for table scraps. Kira had been speaking for 2 hours. She had shown them images of New Cascadia, the human colony world now trapped behind a Velith energy barrier. 14 million people, families, children. The food supplies would run out in 6 months. The Velith had made no demands. They simply wanted to watch humans suffer and die. And the Galactic Concord, the great protector of civilization, had decided to do nothing. We understand humanity's emotional attachment to its colonies, High Arbiter Xyloth said. His voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. But the Velith Dominion is a founding member of this Concord. They have rights and privileges that must be respected. Rights? Kira kept her voice steady. They are starving 14 million people. Children are going to die. A regrettable situation. Xyloth agreed. But escalation serves no one. The Velith have legitimate grievances about human expansion into the Korath sector. We recommend patience, negotiation. Perhaps in 3 solar cycles, we can arrange talks that might lead to a resolution. 3 solar cycles. 3 years. By then, everyone on New Cascadia would be dead. Kira looked around the room. The Torvashi wouldn't meet her eyes. They were traitors, not fighters. The Marathi sat in uncomfortable silence, remembering their own past with humanity. The Kelsics were literally asleep, their species unable to stay awake for meetings longer than 1 hour. No one was going to help. The Velith ambassador, a massive creature named Torath, let out a rumbling laugh. Perhaps the humans should learn their place in this galaxy. They have been part of our civilization for only 80 years. They are children playing at being adults. This blockade will teach them respect. Several delegates murmured in agreement. Kira noticed that they were all species who had never had direct conflict with humanity. The ones who had the Marathi, the Kelsics, a few others, stayed very quiet. Ambassador Vance, Xyloth said, do you have anything else to add before we vote on the resolution of non-interference? Kira was silent for a long moment. She looked at her datapad, where the faces of New Cascadia's children stared back at her. She had promised them that help was coming. She had promised their parents that the galaxy would not let them die. She had been wrong. No, she said finally. I have nothing else to add. The vote was quick. 40 representatives. 37 voted for non-interference. 2 abstained. Only humanity voted against. Kira gathered her things slowly. The crystal walls had turned a satisfied blue, reflecting the mood of the room. The Velith were already celebrating, their forearms slapping together in their species' version of applause. She walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Every eye in the room was on her. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked relieved. A few looked smug. At the threshold, she paused. She didn't turn around. Fine, she said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. I'll handle it. And then she was gone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the mood in the room began to change. The crystal walls flickered from blue to yellow to orange. The Torvashi ambassador made a sound like a deflating balloon. One of the Marathi delegates stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. What did she just say? Someone asked. She said she would handle it. Torath laughed. Handle it? What is one small species going to do against the Velith Dominion? We have the largest fleet in the galaxy. We have... Shut up. The voice came from the Marathi delegate. His face had gone pale gray, which meant he was terrified. Shut up, you fool. Do you have any idea what you've done? Torath stared at him. I have done nothing but defend my people's interests. You have killed us all. Within the hour, the news had spread to every corner of the galaxy. Emergency meetings were called on 100 different worlds. Intelligence agencies that had been sleeping for decades suddenly woke up and started pulling old files. High Arbiter Xyloth sat alone in his chambers, reading reports that his staff had gathered. He had lived for 600 years. He had seen empires rise and fall, He had watched species destroy themselves and others. He thought he understood power. He was beginning to realize he understood nothing. The reports told a story that made no sense. Humanity had joined galactic civilization 80 years ago. They had been friendly, curious, eager to learn. They had traded fairly, made alliances carefully, and never caused any trouble. They had also never lost a war. This seemed impossible. Every species lost eventually. It was the nature of the universe, but the humans had faced the Kreth Syndicate, the Marathi hegemony, the Void Reavers, and a dozen smaller conflicts. Every single time, they had won, and every single time, they had won in ways that no one fully understood. The Kreth Syndicate had kidnapped human colonists for slavery. 6 months later, the Syndicate no longer existed. Their home system's asteroid belt had been mined down to nothing. The raw materials taken for purposes unknown. The Marathi hegemony had attacked a human research station. The humans had won without firing a single weapon. To this day, no one knew how. The Void Reavers had simply vanished after raiding a human colony ship. Vanished completely, as if they had never existed at all. Xyloth put down the reports. His crystalline body was shaking. He sent an urgent message to the Velith Dominion. Stand down. Release the blockade. Apologize. Do it now, before it's too late. The Velith, proud and ancient and stupid, sent back a simple response. No. Xyloth looked out his window at the stars. Somewhere out there, a small human woman was making plans, and the galaxy, for all its power and wisdom, could do nothing but wait and watch and hope that some of them would survive what came next. The crystal walls of his chamber had turned deep red, the color of blood, the color of warning, the color of fear. 3 days after Ambassador Vance spoke those 4 terrible words, the galaxy began to panic. It started quietly, with small things that most people did not notice. Trade ships changed their routes, avoiding any sector within 3 jumps of human space. Insurance companies stopped offering coverage for cargo heading toward the Velith Dominion. Stock prices on the Galactic Exchange began to fall, slowly at first, then faster. The Torvashi Collective was the first to make official changes. They were traders, not warriors, and their entire civilization was built on understanding risk. Their analysts had spent 3 days studying every piece of information they had about humanity. What they found made them very, very nervous. Cancel all shipments to Velith space, the Torvashi High Council ordered. Reroute everything. Do not stop, do not refuel, do not communicate with anyone until you are at least 10 jumps away from any human system. But the contracts, one merchant protested. The penalties will be enormous. The penalties, the council leader said, will be much smaller than losing your ships and your lives. Do you remember what happened to the Kreth? Everyone remembered what happened to the Kreth. They just tried not to think about it. Meanwhile, on the Velith homeworld, Admiral Torath was enjoying his victory. The blockade around New Cascadia was holding perfectly. His ships were the finest in the galaxy, his weapons the most advanced, his crews the most disciplined. What could the humans possibly do against such power? His intelligence director, a nervous female named Vosh, was trying to tell him. Sir, you need to see these reports, she said, placing a stack of data crystals on his desk. Reports about what? Human military strength? I've seen them. They have 47 combat vessels. We have 3,000. Sir, please, just read them. Torath sighed and picked up the first crystal. It contained information about something called the Quiet Offensive against the Marathi hegemony. 30 years ago, the Marathi had attacked a human research station, killing 200 scientists. Everyone expected the humans to respond with military force. Instead, they did nothing. For 6 months, they did nothing. Then, one day, the Marathi economy collapsed. Their computer systems failed. Their communications went dark. Their military commanders started receiving messages containing information that should have been impossible for anyone to know. Secret plans, private conversations, the names and locations of their families. The Marathi surrendered without a fight. They signed a peace treaty that gave the humans everything they wanted, and when asked how they had done it, the human ambassador had simply smiled and said, "We found another way." To this day, no one knew what that way was. Torath put down the crystal. Old news. The Marathi were weak. Sir, there's more. The second crystal contained analysis of human biology. Torath had never bothered to learn about the creatures he was trying to starve. Now he wished he had continued not knowing. Humans were persistence predators. This meant that their ancestors had hunted not by being fast or strong, but by simply following their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They could walk for days without stopping. They could survive injuries that would kill most species. Their bodies healed themselves at impossible speeds. But the physical details were not the worst part. The worst part was their minds. Humans had evolved a trait called spite. This meant that they would accept harm to themselves in order to cause harm to their enemies. They would sacrifice their own comfort, their own safety, even their own lives, just to make sure that someone who wronged them would pay the price. They had a saying, "I will burn down my own house if it means you burn with it." "This is madness," Torith said. "No rational species would think this way." "With respect, sir, rationality is not the human specialty. Stubbornness is." The third crystal was the one that finally made Torath afraid. It contained the human concept of contingency planning. Humans, it turned out, did not wait for problems to happen before thinking about solutions. They spent enormous amounts of time and energy preparing for disasters that might never occur. They had plans for asteroid impacts, disease outbreaks, computer failures, economic collapse, and war with every species they had ever encountered. They called this being prepared. Other species called it paranoid insanity, but it meant something very important. The humans had been thinking about this moment for decades. They had plans for what to do if the Veleth ever threatened them. They had probably been updating those plans every single year, adding new information, finding new weaknesses, preparing new responses. The blockade had been active for 3 days. The humans had been preparing for it for 40 years. Torith finally understood why the Torvashi were running. "What do we do?" he asked. "I recommend we release the blockade immediately and apologize," Vash said. "Perhaps if we—" "Never." Torith's pride was too strong. "We are the Veleth Dominion. We do not surrender to lesser species. Sir, they are not lesser. They are different. And different in this case means dangerous in ways we cannot predict. I will not be remembered as the admiral who ran from humans. Our fleet will hold. Our blockade will continue. And when the humans try to break through, we will destroy them." Vash said nothing more. There was no point. She had already begun making her own contingency plans specifically, plans that involved being very far away when the humans finally made their move. Across the galaxy, billions of beings were having similar thoughts. The Kelsics moved their entire civilian population to underground bunkers. The Marathi sent a secret message to the humans offering any assistance they needed. The crystalline species of Vorth began recording their complete history, just in case someone needed to remember them later. Only the Veleth stood firm, confident in their power, certain of their victory. High Arbiter Xyloth watched it all from his chambers in the Galactic Concord. He had sent 7 more messages to the Veleth, each more urgent than the last. They had ignored every single one. He pulled up the human file one more time and found a phrase that haunted him. "We don't want to escalate. We want to end it." Humans did not fight to win battles. They fought to end wars. Completely. Permanently. In ways that made sure the same problem would never happen again. The Kreth had learned this lesson. They no longer existed. The Marathi had learned this lesson. They were now humanity's closest allies. The Void Reavers had learned this lesson. No one knew what had happened to them. Now it was the Veleth's turn to learn. Xyloth looked at the calendar. 3 days since the ambassador's words. Nothing had happened yet. The humans were quiet. Too quiet. He had lived for 600 years. He had learned that the most dangerous predators were not the ones who roared and charged. They were the ones who waited in silence, patient and calm, until the perfect moment to strike. The humans were waiting. The galaxy was watching. And somewhere, in some room that no one else knew about, Ambassador Kira Vance was making final preparations. The quiet before the storm was almost over. 3 weeks passed after Ambassador Vance made her declaration. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for explosions, waiting for war, waiting for the humans to do something dramatic and terrible. Nothing happened. The human fleet sat outside the Veleth blockade, just watching. They made no aggressive moves. They sent no threats. They simply floated there. 47 small ships against 3,000 Veleth warships, and waited. Admiral Torith began to relax. His intelligence director Vash had clearly been wrong. The humans were not dangerous masterminds with secret plans. They were just a small, weak species trying to look brave. Their ambassador's words had been empty bluster. Nothing more. "You see," Torath told his officers, "they have no real power. They are hoping that we will lose our nerve and retreat. We will not. The blockade continues until the colonists surrender or die. His officers agreed. The mood on the Velith flagship became almost festive. They were going to teach humanity a lesson that the entire galaxy would remember. On the 22nd day, everything changed. It started at exactly midnight, Galactic Standard Time. Across the Velith Dominion, every financial system crashed simultaneously. Not attacked, just gone. 300 years of banking records, transaction histories, currency reserves, all of it vanished in 11 seconds. The Velith economy did not collapse. It simply ceased to exist. Panic spread through Velith space like fire through dry grass. Businesses could not pay their workers. Ships could not buy fuel. Governments could not fund their services. Within hours, the entire Dominion was paralyzed. How is this possible? Torith screamed at his technicians. Our systems were protected by the most advanced security in the galaxy. The technicians had no answer. They would discover the truth weeks later, when forensic experts finally pieced together what had happened. The humans had planted the necessary code 40 years ago, during a routine software update that no one had thought to examine closely. It had sat there, dormant and invisible, waiting for the signal to activate. The humans had been preparing for this specific moment for 4 decades, but the financial collapse was only the beginning. At 12:15 a.m., 17 Velith admirals received personal messages. The messages contained information that should have been impossible for anyone to know. Secret military plans, private conversations with family members, medical records, financial dealings that were not entirely legal, the names and school locations of their children. The messages ended with a simple question: do you want to continue? By 12:30 a.m., all 17 admirals had resigned their commissions and returned home to protect their families. At 1 a.m., the energy barrier around New Cascadia flickered and died. No one knew how. The Velith engineers who had built it swore that it was impossible to disable remotely. They were wrong. At 1:15 a.m., the human fleet moved. The Velith watched in confusion as the 47 human ships approached. How could such a small force threaten 3,000 warships? This was suicide. This was madness. Then the human ships began to transform. Panels slid open, revealing weapon systems that did not match any known design. Engines flared with energy signatures that Velith sensors could not identify. The small, harmless-looking vessels became something else entirely, something fast, something powerful, something terrifying. The humans had been upgrading their ships in place, over 22 days, using fabrication technology that officially did not exist. The ships that had looked like minor threats were now something far more dangerous. Open fire, Torith commanded. The Velith weapon systems did not respond. Every single targeting computer had received the same corrupted update as the financial systems. 40 years ago, they were locked out of their own weapons. What is happening? Torith screamed. Why won't anything work? The answer came from his communications officer, whose face had gone pale with fear. Sir, we're receiving a message from the human flagship. They're asking if we would like to discuss terms of surrender. Surrender? We have 3,000 ships. Sir, we have 3,000 ships that cannot fire their weapons. And their ships. The officer swallowed hard. Sir, their ships can. Torith looked at the tactical display. The human vessels had spread out, each one taking position near a cluster of Velith ships. They were not attacking. They were waiting. The message came again. We would prefer not to fire. We would prefer not to kill anyone. But our colonists have been starving for 3 weeks, and our patience is at an end. You have 5 minutes to withdraw your fleet from New Cascadia. This is not a negotiation. Torith's pride screamed at him to fight, to find some way to resist, to never surrender to these inferior creatures. But his pride could not fire weapons. His pride could not restore his economy. His pride could not protect his crew from the human ships that now surrounded them. Order the fleet to withdraw, he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. The Velith blockade ended without a single shot fired. 12 hours later, relief ships from Earth reached New Cascadia. The colonists, thin and weak but alive, cheered as food and medical supplies arrived. Children who had been preparing to die were suddenly laughing and playing again. Ambassador Kira Vance watched the celebrations from her office on the human flagship. She felt no joy, only tired relief. She had not wanted this. She had asked the Galactic Concord for help. She had tried to solve this peacefully, through proper channels, through diplomacy. They had refused, so she had handled it. Her communication screen lit up with an incoming message from High Arbiter Xyloth. She let it ring for a long moment before answering. "Ambassador Vance," Xyloth said. His crystalline form looked different, somehow smaller, less confident. "The Galactic Concord would like to discuss what has happened." "I'm sure you would," Kira said. "How did you do it? How did you defeat 3,000 ships without firing a weapon?" Kira smiled. It was not a warm smile. "We didn't defeat them, High Arbiter. We convinced them that fighting was a bad idea. There's a difference. The Velith economy has collapsed. 17 of their senior officers have resigned. Their entire military has been humiliated. You call this convincing? I call it consequences. They chose to starve our people. They chose to ignore our warnings. They chose to refuse every peaceful solution we offered. We simply showed them what the alternative looked like." Xyloth was silent for a moment. "What do you want now?" "I want what I wanted 3 weeks ago. Justice for New Cascadia. Reparations for the suffering your Concord allowed to happen. And a guarantee that nothing like this will ever happen again." "And if we refuse?" Kira's smile faded. "Then I suppose I'll have to handle that too." She ended the call. Outside her window, the stars burned cold and bright. Somewhere out there, the Velith were counting their losses. Somewhere else, the Galactic Concord was reconsidering everything they thought they knew about humanity. And somewhere, in quiet rooms on 1,000 different worlds, beings of every species were learning a lesson they would never forget. When humans said, "Fine, I'll handle it," the smart move was to get out of the way. In the weeks after the New Cascadia incident, the galaxy tried to understand what had happened. Intelligence agencies worked overtime. Scientists studied the limited data available. Politicians demanded answers that no one could provide. The truth, when it finally emerged, came from an unexpected source: a junior Torvashi analyst named Quell 7. Quell 7 was young, barely 40 years old by Torvashi standards. He had been assigned to the boring task of reviewing old trade agreements between humanity and other species. It was supposed to be simple paperwork, the kind of job given to new employees who had not yet proven themselves. What Quell 7 found changed everything. He started with the first trade agreement humanity had ever signed, 80 years ago. It was a simple document, covering basic exchange of goods between Earth and the Torvashi Collective. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. But Quell 7 noticed something strange. One small clause allowed human observers to visit Torvashi trading stations for quality assurance purposes. It seemed harmless. Who would object to quality checks? He found the same clause in humanity's agreement with the Kelsics, and the Marathi, and the Velith, and every other species they had ever traded with. For 80 years, human quality assurance observers had been visiting every major trading station, military outpost, and government facility in the galaxy. They had been watching, learning, taking notes. Quell's even dug deeper. He found that human cultural exchange programs always included technical advisors who helped maintain computer systems. These advisors had access to the core programming of every species they worked with. They had been there for decades, quietly helping, quietly watching, quietly waiting. He found that human scientific collaborations always resulted in shared research databases. These databases gave humanity detailed information about every other species' technology, biology, and capabilities. He found that human diplomatic missions always established emergency communication channels that bypassed normal security protocols. These channels could send messages directly to the highest levels of any government, at any time, without warning. The pattern was clear. Humanity had spent 80 years building a network of information and access that covered the entire galaxy. They knew everything about everyone. They had backdoors into every system. They had contingency plans for every scenario. The Velith had not been defeated by a sudden attack. They had been defeated by 40 years of patient preparation. Q7 wrote his report with shaking tentacles. When he finished, he immediately classified it at the highest level. Then he sent copies to every senior official in the Torvashi government. The response was immediate. Within hours, the report had leaked to every intelligence agency in the galaxy. Within days, it was being discussed in secret meetings on 100 different worlds. The revelation changed how every species thought about humanity. High Arbiter Xyloth read the report alone in his chambers, his crystalline form flickering with colors that had no name in any language. He had lived for 600 years. He had seen species rise and fall. He had watched civilizations destroy themselves through war and foolishness. He had never seen anything like humanity. They were not conquerors. They had never tried to take territory or resources from other species. They were not tyrants. They had never tried to impose their will on anyone who did not threaten them first. They were survivors. Xyloth found this concept in human cultural archives. Survival, for humans, was not just a goal. It was an obsession. Their entire history was a story of threats faced and overcome, disasters survived and rebuilt from, enemies defeated and turned into friends. They had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them constantly. Predators hunted them. Diseases ravaged them. Ice ages froze them. Volcanoes burned them. Asteroids nearly destroyed them. Every few million years, something happened that should have ended their species forever. And every single time, they had refused to die. This refusal had shaped everything about them. They planned for disasters that might never happen. They built backups for their backups. They assumed that everything could go wrong and prepared accordingly. Other species called this paranoia. Humans called it common sense. The report included a section on human psychology that Xyloth found particularly disturbing. Humans had a concept called proportional response. This was the idea that your reaction to a threat should match the size of the threat itself. But here was the terrifying part. Proportional response was a restraint, not a strategy. The natural human response to threats was apparently so overwhelming, so complete, so devastating, that they had needed to develop entire philosophical systems just to hold themselves back. Without these systems, humans would not stop at defeating their enemies. They would erase them entirely. The Creeth Syndicate had learned this. They had kidnapped human colonists for slavery. The humans had responded by destroying not just the Syndicate, but everything the Syndicate had ever built. Their home system's asteroid belt, mined for raw materials. Their colonies taken over by species the Creeth had once oppressed. Their culture, their history, their very existence erased from the galaxy. The Veleth had been lucky. The humans had shown restraint. They had collapsed the economy, humiliated the military, and taught a lesson. But they had not destroyed. They had not erased. They had chosen mercy. Xyloth wondered what would have happened if they had not. The report ended with a phrase that Quell 7 had found in human military doctrine. We don't want to escalate. We want to end it. Humans did not fight to win. They fought to make sure they would never have to fight again. They did not defeat enemies. They transformed them into allies, into examples, or into memories. Xyloth put down the report. Outside his window, the galaxy continued to spin. Billions of beings going about their lives, unaware of how close they had come to learning the same lesson the Veleth had learned. He made a decision. He would call an emergency session of the Galactic Concord. He would propose new protocols for dealing with humanity. He would make sure that no other species ever made the mistake of pushing humans to the point where they said those 4 terrible words. Because the report had made one thing very clear. The new Cascadia incident had been humanity holding back. Next time, they might not. And next time was something Xyloth intended to prevent. No matter what it took, he began composing his message, choosing his words carefully. The galaxy was about to change. The old ways of doing things, the arrogance, the dismissal of lesser species, the assumption that military power was all that mattered, these things had to end. Humanity had taught them all a lesson. Now it was time to learn from it. 1 year after the new Cascadia incident, the galaxy was a different place. The Galactic Concord had changed its procedures completely. When human representatives raised concerns, those concerns were addressed immediately. Not because anyone was afraid of what humans would do if they were ignored, although many species were exactly that afraid, but because everyone had finally realized that humans usually knew what they were talking about. They had, after all, been watching very carefully for 80 years. The Veleth Dominion had transformed from humanity's greatest enemy into their most reliable trading partner. This surprised everyone except the humans, who seemed to have expected it all along. You didn't destroy us, Admiral Torath said to Ambassador Vance, at a diplomatic reception, 1 year to the day after the blockade ended. He had been removed from military command, but the humans had requested that he be appointed as the new Veleth ambassador to Earth. You could have. Everyone knows you could have. Why didn't you? Kira took a sip of her drink before answering. Because destruction wasn't the goal. The goal was to protect our people and make sure nothing like this ever happened again. You're more useful to us as friends than as a cautionary tale. But the Creeth were slavers. They would never have changed. You're not slavers. You're just proud and stubborn. She smiled. We understand, proud and stubborn. We're human. Torith laughed. It was a strange sound, coming from him. A year ago, he would have died before laughing with a human. Now, he found himself looking forward to these conversations. Humans were strange creatures, but they were never boring. Across the galaxy, other species were reaching similar conclusions. The Torvashi had reopened all their trade routes and were making record profits from partnerships with human companies. The Marathi had signed a mutual defense treaty with Earth, their ancient grudge finally forgotten. Even the Kelziks, who slept through most diplomatic events, had established a permanent embassy in the human capital. The fear was fading. In its place, something else was growing. Respect. High Arbiter Xyloth hosted a gathering of senior diplomats from every major species. The topic was humanity, and what the galaxy had learned from the new Cascadia incident. They are not what we thought they were, Xyloth began. We saw a young species, new to galactic civilization, and we assumed they were naive. We were wrong. They were never naive, the Torvashi ambassador agreed. They were preparing. Always preparing. The question is, preparing for what? For survival, said the Marathi delegate. Her species had learned this lesson 30 years ago, and they had never forgotten it. Humans do not plan for conquest. They do not dream of empire. They plan for disaster. They prepare for the worst possible outcomes. And when those outcomes happen, they are ready. But why? The Kelziks representative asked, having managed to stay awake for this portion of the meeting. Why are they so focused on survival? What made them this way? Their world, Xyloth answered. I have studied the reports. Earth is a death world. The gravity is crushing. The atmosphere is corrosive. The surface is covered with predators, poisons, and natural disasters. Most species that evolve on such worlds either die quickly or become monsters. And humans? Humans became survivors. They learned that the universe is dangerous and that safety must be earned through constant vigilance. They carry this lesson in their bones, in their culture, in everything they do. The Velith ambassador spoke for the first time. They also learned something else, something we missed. Everyone turned to look at him. They learned the value of cooperation. On their death world, no human could survive alone. They had to work together, trust each other, protect their communities. This is why they care so much about their colonies, their families, their friends. They do not fight for territory or resources. They fight for each other. Silence fell over the room. The assembled diplomats considered this idea, turning it over in their minds like a strange jewel. So they are not conquerors, the Torvashi ambassador said slowly. They are protectors. They do not want to rule us. They just want to live among us, peacefully, if possible, Xyloth agreed. But they will protect their own at any cost at all. Then the lesson is simple, the Marathi delegate concluded. Do not threaten what they love. Do not force them to choose between peace and their people, because they will always choose their people, and they will make sure that whoever forced that choice lives to regret it. Far away, on the human flagship orbiting Earth, Ambassador Kira Vance was having a different kind of conversation. She stood on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Beside her was a young officer named James Chen, one of the many humans who had worked behind the scenes during the new Cascadia crisis. Do you think they finally understand us? James asked. Kira considered the question. I think they're starting to. It took a demonstration, which I regret. But some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Will it last? The peace, I mean. For a while. Eventually someone will forget. Someone will think they can push us without consequences. And we'll have to remind them. That sounds exhausting. Kira laughed softly. It is. But what's the alternative? Let them hurt us? Let them hurt the people we're supposed to protect? No, James admitted. I guess not. They watched the stars in silence for a moment. Then James asked the question that had been bothering him for a year. Ma'am, during the crisis, did you ever think we might actually have to fight? Not just threaten, but really fight? Every single day, Kira said quietly. And I prepared for it. We all did. But I hoped, I prayed actually. Which is not something I usually do, that it wouldn't come to that. Why? Because we would have won. And winning would have meant killing a lot of people who were just following orders, doing what they thought was right. The Velith weren't evil. They were just wrong. And I didn't want to punish them for being wrong by destroying them. Is that mercy? I suppose it is. Kira turned away from the window. Come on. We have work to do. The Kelziks want to discuss a new scientific partnership, And I hear they've actually managed to stay awake for the preliminary meetings. James followed her, but he paused at the door and looked back at the stars one more time. Somewhere out there, billions of beings were learning to see humanity differently, not as a threat to be contained or a curiosity to be studied, but as neighbors, as partners, as friends. It had taken a crisis to get here. It had taken fear and uncertainty, and the very real possibility of war. But they had made it through. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone thought about threatening humanity, they would remember what had happened to the Velith. They would remember the collapsed economy, the humiliated military, the lesson taught without a single shot fired. They would remember 4 simple words and the galaxy-shaking response they had triggered, and they would choose differently. That was the hope. Anyway, that was what humanity was working toward, a galaxy where those words never needed to be spoken again. But if they did need to be spoken, humanity would be ready. They always were. The observation deck fell silent as James left. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings who lived among them. But those beings were changing, growing, learning to understand each other. It was slow work, and it would never truly be finished. But it was good work, and humanity had never been afraid of hard work.